Giant spaceships and extraterrestrials. Are they myth or are they reality? The first observation of a giant spaceship comes from the great soldier Alexander the Great. When in the conquest of Asia, he observed the flight of many small craft, he called them shields, accompanied by a much larger one with a silver color. Let's remember that he had historians, scientists, and journalists basically recording everything every single day of what they were going through. And he actually had a rendezvous with an extraterrestrial Atlantean who would be landing in the Taklamakan desert of China. Taklamakan meaning you go in but you never come out. And he was supposed to be given an advanced extraterrestrial weapon. He lost a third of his warriors there. Over 10,000 of his soldiers were lost there. But he did get that weapon. And supposedly it's what's called the Thunderbolt of Zeus. There's a copy of it in a Buddhist temple in the Himalayas. And supposedly it was some kind of a technology that could switch you from material state of where we are now into an interdimensional existence. Now, in the modern history, we have accounts of astronauts spotting giant craft on the dark side of the moon. An unknown giant craft was also spotted in the vicinity of Mars in the early missions of the Russian exploratory missions. The photos after months of wrangling with astrophysicists and government officials, finally yielded a small result, releasing a document photo showing a Martian moon and a long, narrow, giant object, a pillar that should not have been there. And the following reports are documented come from pioneer Donald E. Kehoe, founder of NICAP, one of the largest UFO research organizations on the planet, July 18, 1967. At the Soviet astronomical station near Kazan, it was an ordinary day until evening. As dusk progressed, two astronomers began their daily observations. Suddenly, a huge flying object appeared moving across the sky at speed, and as it passed over the observatory, its orange glow made it easily visible in the semi-darkness. It was an amazing sight, a huge sickle-shaped craft at least 8 times the size of any known airplane. The crescent moon's horns pointed backwards and gave off exhaust-like jets flying at fantastic speed. The giant spaceship disappeared within seconds. This experience shocked the two astronomers. At first they didn't make a report because they were afraid no one would believe them. However, confirmation of the existence of the giant spaceship came quickly from other astronomers. On August 8, another huge crescent-shaped flying object sped over the Soviet Kislovodsk astrophysical station run by the Soviet Academy of Sciences. This was recorded in the diary by astronomer Anatoly Sanzanov, one of the 12 staff members who saw this monstrous craft. And on September 4th, October 18, and several other days during 1967, similar spacecraft were seen over southern Russia and spotted by astronomers. In February of 68, some of these reports were confirmed in Moscow with an official endorsed statement. The most surprising revelations were the calculations made by the astronomers of the Kazan Observatory after several appearances of the giant spaceship. The diameter of the flying crescents was 500 to 600 meters. That's 1,800 feet. Their speed was about 5 meters per second. This officially endorsed announcement was released by Dr. Fitz Siegel, distinguished scientist at the new UFO Research Committee, which was part of the Union Astronautics Committee. Dr. Siegel was also a central figure in the Moscow Aviation Institute. In Siegel's statement omitting some of the evidence that the Russians had, this did nothing to lessen the concern of the U.S. Air Force. In a previous public announcement, the scientists had strongly implied that UFOs came from a more advanced planet, insisting that there should be an end to the secrecy. He had proposed a global exchange of information about UFOs, and a joint effort by all scientists to judge the facts. On the night of February 15, 1965, a Flying Tiger plane, especially chartered by the Department of Defense of the U.S., was traveling over the Pacific Ocean, carrying a group of Army and Air Force officers to Japan. The flight was an hour from Tokyo when the flight deck radar picked up 3 large fast-moving objects. The operator and pilot thought at first that the radar had malfunctioned. They had never seen such huge spots on its screen. Suddenly above them and to the left, a reddish glow appeared in the sky, and looking up, the captain saw 3 huge oval-shaped objects descending at high speed and in close formation. They appeared to be heading straight for the plane. The pilot turned hastily and then stopped. The 3 giant UFOs changed direction to one side and suddenly slowed down. Now, they were at plane height, still in closed formation. The radar showed them to be 5 miles away, but even from that distance they looked huge. For several minutes the aircrew stood watching the glittering craft. Even though they didn't try to get close, rather their formidable size gave them a menacing aspect, and as the giant ships, the craft continued to follow the passenger plane, the captain sent a crewman back to the cabin. In a few minutes he returned with an Air Force officer. The pilot hoped that, in case of danger, an urgent message would bring jets from Okinawa. But the Air Force officer, after observing in amazement the huge UFOs, warned him not to attempt such a thing. Even if the jets arrived in time, they probably would not be able to do anything and might be inviting a UFO attack. The giant starships continued to follow the plane for several minutes, while anxiety grew in the navigation cabin, and then the formation pitched steeply towards, and the boats and the craft disappeared in seconds, increasing their speed to 1,200 knots. When the plane landed, Air Force intelligence sent a coded report to the Pentagon, which made quite an impression. The Air Force officer who had seen the huge craft had estimated their size, using the distance of 5 miles as a basis. If his calculations were correct, then the 3 spacecraft should have been about 2,000 feet long, maybe more, each of them. Fortunately, for the Air Force, they had descended over the ocean. If they had descended over any major city, panic would have been inevitable. But sometime after that, the newspapers wrote on the front page about the appearance of a huge flying saucer in Antarctica. When the Argentinian Minister of Marines confirmed that pictures had been taken of this huge flying object, if the world's press got the pictures of the spacecraft, the results could have been disastrous. Perhaps the highest government officials in Argentina understood this. Maybe they were convinced how to hide the evidence, but whatever happened, the films were never released. For the U.S. Air Force, this was a much bigger relief than most people realized. The CIA knew since 1953 that giant spaceships were operating near our planet. At least 9 times, huge alien spacecraft had been sighted or spotted in orbit, or even as they briefly descended closer to Earth. Each time, Air Force censors went through an ordeal as they struggled to withhold the reports, or when their efforts at secrecy failed, to give them an interpretation. During 1953, the Air Force began experimenting with long-range radar components. While conducting the initial test, Air Force operators were astonished to see on radar a giant object orbiting near the equator. Its speed was 18,000 miles an hour. Double-checking showed that the endorsement was correct. Some huge unknown object was circling the Earth 600 miles outside of Earth. And shortly after this, the second massive object approached Earth, and it was spotted by Air Force radar experts, and it too entered orbit at about 400 miles from Earth. Frightened, the heads of the Department of Defense, the USA, put forward an urgent program to discover artificial satellites in White Sands, New Mexico. Responsible for this secret service was the scientist Dr. Clyde Tombaugh, who discovered Pluto. the only distinguished astronomer who admitted that he had seen UFOs. The scan of the skies was a joint project of the armed forces under the supervision of Military Research Service in February, and in February 1954, an article in the Astronomical Society of the Pacific described various plans for the search for artificial satellites, meaning UFOs, of course. Now, quoting Dr. Tombaugh, he was saying how special telescope equipment would be used. The article was written before the program was implemented, and there was no allusion to giant spacecraft. The business was called Searching for Physical Objects. But quickly, the guy smelled that there was something hidden in the case. The employees of the Military Research Service at White Sands were inundated with questions. Indeed, there were artificial satellites where they were unknown. And where did they come from? How many were there? The censors at first began to cover things up, but Dr. Tombaugh convinced them that this was unwise. On March 3rd, an official explanation approved by the Pentagon was released at White Sands. The Military Intelligence Service said the armed forces were looking for miniature moons, of course, objects that had come from space and were now in orbit around our Earth. They were not detected or discovered sooner because they were orbiting near the B equator, and the lack of observations there made their detection very difficult. They would also need special auto detectors that would move at the speed of artificial satellites, because these fast-moving objects emitted very little light and would not be seen by ordinary telescopes. The spokesman explained that the purpose of the armed forces from the United States was to locate tiny moons suitable for use as space bases and for launching missiles for the defense of the country. There was no suggestion that the unknown satellites might be craft piloted by intelligent beings. On May 5th, two huge objects maneuvered at high altitude over Washington and were detected by the National Airport radar. The next day, Navy radar picked up a huge machine circling 90,000 feet above the Capitol. On June 12th, another giant craft, or perhaps the same, made a nocturnal appearance hovering between Washington and Baltimore at 79,000 feet. The Air Defense Services immediately ordered fighters to take off to be ready in case of foreign aircraft descended. For an hour, the giant craft maintained its great height while Air Force jets circled powerlessly beneath it, and then it rose with speed and disappeared. 2 nights later, the same spacecraft, or a similar one, returned to the Washington area, and this time it stayed there for 2 hours, maneuvering between the Capitol and Baltimore. And once again, the Air Defense Service jets took off hastily while a coast-wide alert was sounded. The foreign machine, that is, the foreign craft, the UFO, gave no sign of hostile intent, nor let it be seen what its purpose was. This case was kept secret for about a month, and when it was leaked to the newspapers, the Air Defense Service admitted the alert but claimed the fighter pilots had seen nothing. An Air Force pilot who told the truth about those 2 hours of agony said, "You saw that giant spaceship and thought you were in a nightmare. I don't know what we would have done if it had come down to us," he said. From the Gulf of Mexico spotted 3 formations of UFOs flying at 5,240 miles per hour. Another formation flew between the bomber, slowed down to follow, then flew towards a large craft that suddenly appeared on the bomber's radar. Within seconds, the smaller UFOs merged with the giant craft. Apparently, this was a prearranged appointment for the gathering of the smaller units. Immediately upon entering, the giant shuttle increased its speed to 9,000 miles per hour and passed out of radar range. The UFO sighting took place at a speed of over 5,000 miles per hour. The report from the Gulf of Mexico was handed to me in early '53, before the CIA took over the case and the cover-up intensified. And later, radar engineers estimated the size of the transport vessel, this huge UFO, based on the indication of the large blip that had been seen on the radar screen of the bomber. and they estimated that the giant vessel was about 1,200 feet long. This is just one of the many confirmed reports of huge transport motherships, huge UFOs that have either been seen or detected by radar. And this I've translated from a Greek article. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.